The silence in colonial America held a different weight, a cold promise that gripped your spine before the first pale blue light of winter dawn seeped through the cracked boards. Your breath escaped in small clouds, mingling with the aged smoke curled low from the hearth. The scent sharp and persistent, smoke and damp straw woven tightly into the fabric of this modest wooden cabin. Outside, the village lay shrouded in a thin mist, the uneven paths barely visible beneath the soft cloak of gray morning. A faint clatter echoed, wooden wheels laboring over rough terrain, the relentless grind of a sharpening stone slicing through the quiet. It was a slow rhythm, unchanging, measured by the sun's patient arc rather than ticking clock hands you didn't possess. You felt the stubborn chill settle deep in your bones as you blinked away the grit clinging to your eyelashes. The scratchy woolen blanket offered little comfort, more an irritant than a balm, and beneath it, the coarse linen shirt rubbed relentlessly against your skin. Today, as yesterday and the day before, was one of those days, plodding, endless, and utterly ordinary. If today, a dead phone battery sends you into a miniature panic, here, imagine the despair of watching your last sliver of firewood collapse into cold ash, knowing the night would answer only with darkness, silent and cruel. No modern thermostats would rescue you from this bone-deep cold. Rising from the straw-stuffed mattress, you noticed the rough loaf of bread on the table, its broken surface flecked with hints of sawdust, an old tactic to stretch limited flour supplies. Hunger was as regular a companion as the morning chores, fetching icy water from the well, coaxing life from slow-burning embers, scraping wooden bowls, and tending the animals that clucked and crowed just beyond the cabin's hollow heart. Yet, within this relentless cycle, glimpses of warmth appeared. The shared heat gathered round the community fire pit, woolen mittens pressed together to thaw stubborn fingers, and soft, brief laughter echoing against the bare walls of hardship. These fragments, though small, flickered like fragile candlelight in a sea of gray. But just when the quiet seemed steady, a subtle shift pricked the air. A sudden hush where barking dogs had marked their territory. A pair of neighbors exchanged a glance, heavy with unspoken concern, their eyes dark and sharp beneath furrowed brows. Something unnameable unsettled the morning's rhythm, and as the village held its breath against that lingering, looming uncertainty, you could only wonder what shadow was creeping beyond this worn threshold. Hey, before Morpheus fully takes you under, do a quick check to see if you're still subscribed. The button's been playing hide and seek for some, and I wouldn't want you to miss the next bedtime stories. While you're at it, leave a soft like a pillow's embrace. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time. It is for you. Your interaction keeps this little corner of calm alive. Thanks for being part of it. The neighbors' uneasy glances lingered longer than the morning mist. clinging like an unseen chill. You stepped outside, the brittle air slicing at your cheeks, now raw from the frost's persistent nips. Underfoot, the earth felt brittle and reluctant, the paths hardened by seasons of frozen breaths and whispered prayers. The village lay still, as if caught in a breath held too long. No dogs barked, no children's distant calls. Even the chickens seemed subdued, their usual clucks replaced by restless silence. You shifted your weight, adjusting your thin cloak against the chill that burrowed deeper than your scant protection. Your eyes caught movement, not far beyond the fence where the withered fields met the tangled line of trees. Shadows, yes, but elongated, too deliberate to be natural. The neighbors' exchange of looks began to make sense in a way that gnawed at the back of your mind. A tension, almost tangible, like the moment before a candle flickers out, leaving only darkness. From the corner of the nearby shed, a faint scrape disturbed the morning's brittle stillness, a sound so subtle it might have been dismissed. Dry branches rubbing against worn wood, or perhaps something heavier, dragging slowly. You swallowed the lump rising in your throat, trying to ground yourself with the sharp taste of the smoky air. The villager's eyes darted towards the same direction, lips parting in whispered conjecture. You felt the weight of their fear, a tightly wound coil in the belly of the village. Fear here was a daily seasoning, but today it bore a different flavor, sharper, colder. Not the usual dread of winter's merciless hunger or the unseen scourge creeping silently from the woodline. No, this was something less definable, like a shadow pressing just beyond sight. The cracked planks of the cabin creaked softly as you returned inside, drawing the heavy door behind you with a hesitation you hadn't expected. The room seemed smaller somehow, the smoke from the hearth curling sluggishly towards the ceiling, as if resisting the cold that sought to reclaim its dominion. Your fingers sought the warmth of the fire, but the embers were weak, sighing their final breaths before surrendering to ash. Each stick burned away a fragment of comfort, leaving you exposed to the winter's cruel grip. The wooden bowl before you held scant scraps of porridge, its thin, tepid surface reflecting the pale morning light filtering through the cracks. There was hunger here, as ever, not just the gnawing of an empty stomach, but the hunger that pressed beneath shoulders, bowed by cold and worry. The yearning for something intangible, a spark of hope, a sign that the shadows looming at the edge of life could be held at bay. Outside, the sky thickened, a slow, oppressive gray, swallowing the last hints of pale blue. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it scents both familiar and strange. Earth damp, smoke, the faint metallic edge of something unspoken. The hairs on your neck prickled, a silent alarm that settled alongside the fretful glances exchanged between neighbors. From somewhere deep in the village, a single bell tolled, Not the midday call, nor the evening chime, but a slow, deliberate sound, stretched tight with urgency. The villagers paused, their daily rhythms interrupted by this sudden violation of predictability. You found yourself drawn back outside, the mute summons pulling you as though by invisible threads. The chill clung to your skin, your breath now visible in thick, ghostly clouds as you crossed the uneven ground. The frozen earth crunched beneath your worn boots, echoing in the silence like the faint, steady tick of a distant clock. Near the fire pit, a small crowd had begun to gather. Faces pale, eyes wide and unblinking, locked in a vigil against some nameless threat. The usual comfort of shared warmth was absent, replaced by an aching tension that stretched from one frostbitten hand to another. One of the elders, hands gnarled like the roots of the ancient oaks surrounding the village, stepped forward, his voice rough as the bark, scratching at his fingers. He spoke not a word, but the weight of his gaze felt like a warning, whispered through the settling cold. The crowd stirred, breaths held and released like waves pulling back before crashing on unseen shores. Somewhere near, a child whimpered, the sound swallowed quickly by the thickening gray of the morning. You glanced toward the tree line, heart quickening. Among the twisting trunks, a figure crouched, just beyond the edge of vision, a silhouette cut from shadow, unaware it had been seen. The fear that gripped the village now sought to carve itself into your own ribs. Returning your gaze to the gathered faces, you saw reflection not just of dread, but of something more, a fragile thread of defiance trembling in the cold air. Somewhere beneath the bread stretched thin, and the frostbitten fingers rubbed raw by wool mittens, a spark remained. With that thought, you stepped closer to the fire pit, the faint glow doing little to fend off the growing dark. The cold was no longer just a matter of bones and breath. It was something pulling at the soul of the village, a silent shadow, creeping, patient and unyielding. And as the bell tolled again, slow and certain, you realized that the quiet you had been so accustomed to was no longer just absence of sound. It was a presence, waiting. Something was coming to break the stillness, and the night, this time, would not wait in silence. You stepped closer to the fire pit, the weak flames dancing as if they too were wary of the morning shadow. The brittle chill gnawed at your fingers, despite the woolen mittens, each breath stealing warmth away your lungs might have mustered moments before. Around you, faces pale and drawn were lit by the flickering blaze, the kind of light that casts more darkness than it dispels, a fragile barrier against the growing silence. The bell tolled once more, the deep chime reverberating softly against the bones of the village. It was not a call to work, nor a summons to prayer, but something else, something older, bolder, a sound pregnant with warning and waiting. Conversations died wherever they had tried to stir. Even the wind seemed to pause in reverence or dread. You scanned the crowd, finding yourself drawn to a woman standing just across the circle. Her eyes, sharp, beneath the crease of a brow shadowed by time, held a storm of worry and unspoken words. She glanced toward the tree line, her lips pressed tight. The others followed her gaze, their breaths catching as one. It wasn't just fear they shared. It was an ancient awareness, a quiet knowledge that something was not quite right at the edges. The figure in the woods hadn't moved. Crouched low beneath the twisted branches, it watched with an intensity that rooted you to the spot. Your pulse thudded, a slow drumbeat marking time against the growing tension. The presence out there was deliberate, patient, and utterly alien to the fragile rhythm of daily survival you had known. Minutes passed, or maybe only heartbeats. Time had lost its meaning in moments like these. Then, a soft murmur rippled through the villagers, a collective breath held halfway between caution and impending action. The elder beside you raised a trembling hand, and the murmurs faded into a heavy silence again. From the depths of the wood, a sudden crack ricocheted, the dry snap of brittle twigs breaking under weight unknown. The sound shattered the fragile stillness, sending a wave of nervous energy through the crowd. Eyes widened, heads swiveled instinctively toward the origin. But the shadow between the trees refused to shift. It was the patience of something waiting to emerge or retreat, both threats equal in the daylight's quiet gray. You swallowed hard, the smoke and cold filling your senses with a raw urgency. The regular misery of winter, the hunger, the frost, the endless chores, burned away into something sharper, more personal. This was not a battle against nature. It was a confrontation with the unknown, an unseen thread pulling taut around the village's fragile neck. Behind you, the cabin door creaked open slowly, catching your attention. A faint figure appeared in the doorway, one of the younger men, his face pale and eyes flickering with unshed questions. He stepped forward with hesitant resolve, clutching a simple wooden spear, its tip worn but ready. You felt the weight of the moment press against your ribs, the breath in your lungs catching like a trapped bird. Around the fire, hands tightened on makeshift weapons. Pitchforks, axes dulled from long use, even sturdy branches torn from the woods. The veneer of daily routine peeled away to reveal a raw survival instinct buried beneath. Then, from somewhere deeper in the village, another sound arose, soft at first, then louder, a staccato hammering that echoed like the distressed beating of a moth's wings trapped against glass. It was the rhythmic thump of feet running, fading into the sudden hush of footsteps stopping, approaching, hesitating. All eyes shifted again, this time toward the narrow lane that led away from the clearing and into the heart of the settlement. A figure broke through the morning's gray, carrying news that could fracture the fragile hope kindling among the wary faces. The elder's gaze hardened, and he motioned sharply for silence. "Speak." His voice cracked with age and urgency. The young man hesitated, then let his eyes settle on you as if finding both question and strength in your presence. "From the east, beyond the ridge, fires burn," he said, voice low but steady. "Smoke on the horizon, not the smoke of hearths or cooking, something else." The words sank like stones into the frozen earth. You thought of the tight glances, the unnatural silence creeping through the village air, and the figure crouched in the tree line behind the fence. This was no ordinary winter's threat. A shiver traced its way down your spine, unbidden and relentless. Yet amid the frost that bit into your face, and the brittle world holding its breath, a stubborn ember glowed inside, a flicker of something defiant, stubborn, human. It whispered that you would face what was coming, as you always had, with all the raw, weary hope this cold land could bear. Behind the circle, the first leaf thrashed loose from a bare branch, spiraling slow and hesitant, as if uncertain about the descent. The sky above thickened further, a ceiling of steel gray pressing down. The village held tight, suspended in the gathering dark. And then, as the cracked bell began its toll once again, a sound now threading itself into your very pulse, you caught the faintest flicker of movement at the edge of sight. A flash of cloth, or perhaps shadow, slipping away into the unseen. The waiting was over. Darkness was coming, and this time it would not be silent. The cold settled deeper now, gripping your lungs with each breath drawn into the faded dawn. The chill wasn't just in the air. It clung to the bones of the village, seeping through the cracks in wooden walls, and threading itself through the very threads of worn cloaks and mittens. Around the fire pit, the flickering flames shivered, their faint glow trembling behind faces drawn tight with worry and fatigue. You felt the weight of countless eyes, not quite trusting, yet holding on to that fragile ember of courage, barely alive in the frozen air. The woman nearby, her eyes sharp but shadowed, seemed to carry more than fear, resilience, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if not for the way her fingers clutched the edges of her shawl. Knuckles pale, steady in that restless grip. The snap of a twig from the woods behind the fence sliced through the brittle quiet again. Heads snapped toward the sound. Silent acknowledgments passed in the shifting gazes. That shadow in the tangle of branches didn't shift, didn't retreat. It waited, an unseen predator calmly playing its part in the slow unraveling of morning. Your heart kicked hard against your ribs, an unwelcome drumbeat echoing the rising anxiety spilling through the crowd. The elder's tired eyes met yours, holding a question you couldn't yet answer. And then somehow the air thickened, expectant, like the moment just before a storm finally breaks. There was a rustle behind you, a low footstep, hesitant but deliberate. Turning, you saw the young man who had returned earlier with news of the distant fires. His lips pressed into a thin line, face pale as if the chill had gnawed deeper into his flesh. He carried a spear crudely carved from tree limb, a symbol as much of hope as it was of despair. Around the circle, others shifted too. Axes and forks, once tools for survival, suddenly felt heavier, as if the weight of what might be coming pressed down on every crooked handle and splintered blade. You traced the gleam in the flickering firelight, imagining metal dulled by long winters and hands too numb to hold steady. The panic was not in the trembling of limbs, but in the shared silence that swallowed words before they could be spoken. The bell's toll echoed again, a low, deliberate sound that undulated through the village like a living thing. Not a summons, nor a warning shouted aloud, but something older, carved from fear and memory. It stretched across the frozen earth and up into your throat, wedging itself between each measured breath. Outside the circle, the clouds churned, a vast, rolling gray sea ready to spill cold secrets across the land. A faint wind carried scents sharp and strange, smoke, damp earth, and something metallic, like the whisper of blades sliding through air. You tightened your cloak around your shoulders, the rough wool biting skin already raw from frost. The familiar ache, a grim companion. The woman's voice broke the silence, barely more than a breath, sharp and urgent. "They come with the fire," she said, eyes never leaving the tree line. "Not men, something else, something hungry." A murmur threaded through the neighbors, half question, half prayer. Your gaze flicked again to the figure crouched beyond the fence. For the first time, it shifted slightly, like a shadow stretching its limbs before a sinister dance. The air seemed to constrict, pressing in from all sides. Your breath came quicker now, mist curling and vanishing fast. In the cold, the fire pit's flames flared suddenly, as if startled by the weight pressing down on them. For a split second, the dance of orange and gold seemed to mimic a heartbeat, alive, fleeting, fragile. Then came the sound, the rhythmic pounding, muffled footsteps crashing over frozen earth, quick and uneven. Eyes snapped up to the lane, where trees arched over the path, darkness pooling below their branches. The village exhaled a collective, held breath, every gaze snapping toward the noise, hope flickering beside dread. A figure appeared, clad in rough-spun, breath steaming as they stumbled into the fire's glow. Their face was a smear of frost and grime, eyes wild with exhaustion and fear. The voice that burned from trembling lips was low but constant. "They're coming faster. The fires, they're not the only thing we need to fear. The woods, The shadows! They're moving. Silence fell like a shroud, the resonance of those words folding into the cold. You felt the old ache of winter's weariness harden into something far colder, an unknown pressing against the edges of the world you knew. Behind the figure, the wind caught a leaf, spiraling it in slow descent, an unspoken dance of endings and beginnings. The fire sputtered, casting long, twisted shapes that swallowed the spaces between. Faces tightened, breaths hissed in the frost, and the village, once a place of measured survival, held its fragile breath tight. Because now, under the weight of a shadowed dawn, waiting was a luxury lost. And just for a heartbeat, you glimpsed it, a movement at the edge of sight, a flicker of cloth, a pale blink of eyes watching, ready. The winter silence was breaking. Something darker, deeper, was uncoiling from the woods, and this time it promised to answer. The cold had settled into your bones like an unwelcome guest, stubborn and unforgiving. Around the fire pit, the faint crackling of smoldering twigs fought a losing battle against winter's clutch. You drew your cloak tighter, the rough wool itching under your chin, as the restless faces around you remained locked in a hush heavier than the frost that clung to every breath. That low, deliberate toll of... The bell echoed again, its vibration threading through your ribs and stirring something ancient, something raw beneath the surface of the cold and smoke. It was a summons without words, one that pressed the villagers into an uneasy stillness, as if the sound itself carried the weight of an unspoken doom. A sudden movement near the tree line snapped your gaze outward. The shadow, no longer just a shape crouched in waiting, shifted with unnatural stealth, slipping just beyond the edge of clarity like a whispered warning. The eyes that met yours, fierce, unreadable, vanished into the blackened folds of the woods, leaving you with a lasting chill far colder than the biting wind. You swallowed, the bitter taste of smoke and frozen earth tangling with your tingling senses. The village's fragile courage wavered, tapering like a candle guttering in an unexpected draft. Somewhere behind the tight circle, a child's muffled sob broke the silence, and you felt the hush momentarily fracture, only to be sealed back shut by the weight of collective fear. Your gaze shifted to the elder, whose face was a map of wrinkles and worry, shadows mingling with lines, as if years of hardship had etched this moment deep within him. His eyes scanned the crowd before settling on you, a silent plea passing between you, not for strength, but for presence, for bearing the knowing that what came was unlike any enemy they'd faced before. A breath escaped you, freed suddenly by the urgent beat of footsteps plodding through the frost-hardened earth. The young man who'd spoken earlier pushed through the gathering, the wooden spear trembling slightly in his grip. His face was pale, lips cracked and chin set with grim resolve. "They're getting closer," he said, barely louder than the wind that danced with icy fingers around the clearing. "The fires we saw on the ridge, Smoke spreads like a warning, and I saw others, figures, moving through the trees, silent and fast. Not men. The words struck like ice shards against your chest. Not men. The air thickened around you, pressed tight with the weight of unvoiced horrors. You felt the stirrings of a fight, not just for warmth or food, but for the very pulse of the village's existence. Faint murmurs rippled through the crowd as neighbors exchanged haunted glances. The woman who had held your attention remained silent, her jaw clenched so tightly it seemed felt in the taut tendons of her neck. Her eyes darted to the darkened woods, watching for something that refused to be seen. Without warning, the fire flared, a brief, angry blaze that cast towering shadows against the rough-hewn walls of the cabins. For a flicker, the flames danced as if alive, then dwindled, leaving the night's incoming darkness all the more palpable. Your fingers curled around the cold handle of a nearby pitchfork, the metal rough and biting through your gloves. This was no longer about daily survival or the cruel grind of frostbitten days. This was a reckoning, creeping in silence, a slow and patient unraveling. The bell tolled again, its sound a slow heartbeat, thumping through the frozen village. The weight of waiting was unbearable. You could almost hear the forest itself hold its breath, every rustle and snap magnified into a portent. Then, the sharp crack of a branch breaking close, too close. Heads whipped toward the lane leading from the woods. The figure who emerged was gaunt, cloaked in darkness, eyes wild with stories no one wanted to hear. He stumbled forward, mud and sweat streaking his face, voice a cracked whisper, barely clinging to life. "They come with shadows," he gasped. "Not just fire, something else. The woods bleed sound now. We're not alone." The crowd's breath caught, the sound swallowed by a thick silence that pressed like snow upon your chest. You swallowed hard, eyes drifting back to the wavering tree line, where the first snowflakes began to fall, slow and soft, as if mourning the light slipping away. In that freeze-framed moment, the promise of dawn was shattered. A wind gust sliced through the clearing, carrying with it whispers too faint to understand, but heavy with threat. The women pulled their shawls tighter, hands trembling as they clung to fleeting warmth. The men shifted, gripping axes and spears, turns of their heads, betraying vigilance that ran deeper than duty. You inhaled a lungful of the cold, the smoke-infused morning air, lining your lungs with bitter promise. The night was no longer a distant threat. It was moving in, patient and unyielding. The silence had fractured, but in its place, a new sound rose, the quiet, measured breathing of a darkness waking, poised to claim this fragile speck of life. And then, just beyond where the firelight dared to reach, a faint flicker, no more than a twitch of movement, a flash of cloth against the shadows. You held your breath, because whatever hunted the edges of this wintered world was stepping forward. And this time, the silence would not wait. The young man's voice hung in the cold like a fragile whispered prayer, vanishing quickly into the heavy silence that swallowed the fire pit and the gathered faces. His warning settled like frost on every shoulder, a chilling truth that pressed harder than the winter's bite. You felt the weight of the village's eyes hinge on your presence, a quiet question in their gaze, not demanding heroes, but someone to stand steady in the slow unraveling. The smoke from the hearth drifted thin and gray toward the ceiling, barely fighting the cold that seemed to creep not just through wood and bone, but into the very heart of this fragile community. Outside, a tail of wind wound through the tree line, carrying with it a scent strange and sharp, smoke, wet earth, and something faintly metallic, like iron kissed by blood long dried. You drew your cloak a little tighter, wool biting tender skin already reddened by the frost's persistent caress. The villagers shifted uneasily, the brittle wood beneath their feet creaking softly, echoing the tension that had settled deep inside the clearing. Conversations flickered and died before they could fully spark, swallowed by a collective breath held just shy of breaking. That figure crouched beyond the fence, the shadow you'd glimpsed since dawn, remained motionless, a sleek silhouette carved out of the deepest charcoal dusk. Eyes, sharp and knowing, glinted briefly between the gnarled branches before vanishing again like a secret whispered too softly to catch fully. The elder's rasping inhale shattered the silence. His fingers tightened on a gnarled staff, knuckles whitening. His gaze swept across the crowd before landing with aching solemnity on you. It was not a call to arms, nor a plea for courage. It was a shuddering recognition that the road ahead would hold no simple answers. Around you, the fire sputtered fitfully, the flames too weak to hold back the encroaching gray. It was as if even the light itself hesitated, wary of what the dark beyond promised. Suddenly, a delicate clatter stole across the frozen ground, a soft rattle, like dry bones skittering through brittle leaves. Heads turned sharply to the lane winding through the woods. Shadows lengthened against the frost-clad trunks, swallowing the path whole. From the gloom stepped a woman, cloaked in heavy wool, her breath steaming in ragged bursts. Her eyes were wild, reflecting the flickering firelight with fierce urgency. Without pause, she pushed into the circle, collapsing to her knees, her voice hoarse but urgent. "They're near," she gasped. "Not just the fires. Shadows move through the trees, hungry, endless. They don't tire." A hush swallowed her words. The fire seemed to dip in response, the sparks wilting like trapped moths. The villagers exchanged tight glances, the brittle hope washing away beneath waves of mounting dread. You bent slightly toward the woman to catch the finer thread of her breathless warning. A voice from you would be fragile here, overshadowed by the enormity settling over the clearing. Survival had always been a measured battle, weighed in daily chores and slow survival. But this was a darkness that seeped deeper than frozen earth, settling into bones and souls alike. Around you, the first leaf of winter trembled loose from its brittle branch, spinning in a hesitant descent that blurred through the thinning light. It landed on the frozen ground, snuffed out without sound, an ending small but full of unspoken purpose. Then came the footsteps. Not many, just a few, quick and uneven, crunching harshly over the frozen earth. The crowd stiffened, eyes locking onto the lane once more as figures emerged cautiously from the shadows. Their faces were pale masks, carved by fear and fatigue, eyes darting like frightened birds. They carried no weapons, just the ragged remnants of clothing and burdens too heavy to name. They bore stories in their silence, stories etched in frost and hollow cheeks. One collapsed near the fire pit, gasping like a creature dragged from some deep oubliette of despair. "The woods," he rasped. "They come with the cold, with the hunger that's older than us all. Not men, beasts. No, worse. The night itself moves. For a heartbeat, the village lay frozen in the space between words and reality. The hunger you carried in your own chest twined with something new, a cold suspicion wrapped in shadow. The fire shuddered again as the wind snuck in through. Cracked shutters, carrying a sharp, metallic scent. The flames sputtered low, then flared suddenly, casting long fingers of light that stretched and fractured over faces drawn tight with dread. You could almost feel the pulse of the night outside, the heavy breath of something waiting beyond the thin veil of trees. The crisp bite of frost clung to your lungs, tightening with every breath. Then, almost unnoticed, a flash of movement darted behind the crowd, just beyond the firelight's reach. A cloth, pale and fluttering, slipped between trunks like a wisp of smoke, vanishing before recognition could catch it. The village held its breath. Darkness was no longer distant, no longer patient. It was stepping forward, and with it, the silence began to crack, not with noise, but with the slow, inevitable promise of what was to come. The chill deepened, folding around you like a second skin, unyielding and sharp where it caught at exposed cheeks. The fire pit's meager flames flickered, casting trembling shadows that made the surrounding faces look carved from stone and frost. They were drawn tight, eyes darting between the wavering light and the dark beyond, as if trying to hold back the night itself with sheer will. The bell tolled again, slow and mournful, each chime seeming to carry the weight of something unseen pressing ever closer. A thin wind swept through the village, stirring the dry leaves in hesitant swirls, carrying with it the faintest scent, you. couldn't quite name. Was it ash or the bitterness of fear, burning quietly in the cold air? A murmur rose, soft and fragile, from those around you, voices barely more than breath. The woman across the fire pit held her shawl tighter, the knuckles of her clenched fists whitening as she stared toward the woods. Her eyes flicked to you then, a flash of something fierce beneath the veil of worry. Not just fear, but a readiness anchored deep in her bones. Your gaze followed hers. The woods stood as a dark wall at the edge of the clearing, the branches gaunt and twisted like the fingers of some sleeping giant. Yet there, a subtle motion, the shadow crouched between bleached trunks, just beyond reach. Eyes glimmered briefly, sharp, alert, but impossible to read. A predator's patience. The village held itself in a frozen breath. The brittle earth cracked faintly beneath restless feet. Somewhere, a child whimpered, but it was swallowed by the frozen silence as quick as it came. Then, a sudden sharp crack, a branch broken under weight, too deliberate to be accident. Heads snapped in unison, eyes blazing toward the lane leading into the woods. A figure stumbled forward, breath ragged and hot in the winter air, face streaked with frost and grime. His tattered cloak clung to him like a shadow, eyes wide and haunted. "They're closer," he rasped, voice cracked and low. "Not the fires alone. The woods move, creatures that don't tire, that hunt before the smoke's even cold." His words settled like ice settling in your chest, and the fragile threads holding the village steady seemed to fray under their weight. The fire flared briefly, as if startled by the truth laid bare, casting wild shapes that danced like phantoms across drawn faces. You felt the metal cool and rough of a pitchfork pressed against your palm, a silent reminder of the fragile armor you all wore against this encroaching shadow. No longer just cold, hunger, or work. This was something that clawed at your spirit, rude and untamed. Around you, the murmurs fell away, leaving only the rhythm of shallow breaths and the fire's fading crackle. The elder leaned heavily on his twisted staff, gaze sweeping the circle before resting on you. A quiet wordless plea passing between you, heavy and raw. There were no promises here, only the shared weight of an uncertain dawn creeping into the edges of every soul. Outside the circle, the trees seemed to lean inward, as if drawn by the gravity of the night's coming. The wind tugged at loose branches and elf-haunted leaves, carrying whispers too faint to grasp, but sharp enough to send a shiver that long outlasted the gust. Then a movement, swift and sudden, just beyond the firelight's fragile reach. A flicker of cloth, a shadow slipping between knotted trunks like smoke dissolving in dawn. Every gaze snapped toward it, breaths hitching, hearts tightening, as if the air itself bristled with warning. The cold pressed closer now, seeping deep into your bones, carrying a silent promise that the fragile quiet was about to shatter. A final toll of the bell cut through the frozen dawn, deep and resonant, an unyielding heartbeat measured in the lengths of absence and fear. And then, just at the edge of vision, beyond where the fire dared to hold sway, a pair of eyes blinked open in the dark, watching, waiting, moving toward you. The fire's fragile warmth trembled beneath your outstretched fingers, a breath held too long, as if the flames themselves feared the cloak of cold darkness swallowing the village. Each ember's glow flickered uncertain, casting long shadows over the drawn faces gathered close, faces etched with weariness, but sharpened by a silent resolve heavier than the thickest winter coat. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd, like restless whispers rising from frost-hardened earth. The woman's sharp eyes never left the woods beyond the fence, where the crouched shadow had shifted once more, now stepping just beyond concealment. Her voice, when it came, was a blade slicing through the chilling haze, low and urgent. They're closer. The fire on the ridge is no distraction. They're coming. The fire sputtered, a gust of wind stealing its breath. You swallowed hard, the bitter taste of smoke weaving with the cold air. The village felt suspended between heartbeats, caught in a fragile pause that could shatter at the faintest touch. Around you, hands clenched spears and forks, knuckles white beneath coarse gloves. The usual weight of survival, the mundane hardness of frostbitten days, gave way to a raw edge, a sharp reminder that this cold was more than weather. It was an unrelenting presence, patient and creeping, pressing into the soul. From the back of the circle, the elder shifted forward, leaning heavily on his gnarled staff. His gaze swept the gathered faces, settling with a somber steadiness on yours. A silent calling for steadiness, even if courage had long since fled to colder places. You felt the weight of silence settle like fresh snow as he spoke, his voice rough but deliberate. We stand on the edge now, not just of winter, but of something older. A faint clatter stirred beyond the trees, the brittle snap of a branch bending under weight. Heads jerked toward the lane, where shadows throbbed just beneath the skeletal canopy. The figures emerging were no longer ghosts of imagination, but flesh, gaunt, dusted with frost, eyes wild like trapped animals. They carried no weapons, only ragged clothes clinging to bones that seemed too sharp for survival. The first to collapse near the fire pit coughed a ragged warning, voice harsh and broken. They come, not men. The hunger beneath the cold, worse. His breath steamed, trembling in the silence that swallowed his words whole. The fire flared suddenly, jets of light leaping upward before retreating into sputters. Faces around you paled further, shadows dancing like phantoms over frozen skin. You gripped the pitchfork tighter, the rough metal biting through your gloves, grounding you in the grinding cold and mounting dread. The woman nearby whispered again, barely audible. The woods, they bleed with their passing. Not just fire, but silence. Silence that hunts. A sharp wind cut through the clearing, whipping loose ashes from the hearth into spirals that vanished into the gray canvas above. It carried the brittle scent of char and damp earth, mingled now with something metallic, almost coppery, like a distant warning whispered through hollow bones. Suddenly, the pale leaf spiraled downward, a hesitant dance against the rising gloom. It brushed the frozen ground soundlessly, breaking the tense spell for a heartbeat, and then returning the village to its grim vigil. From the corner of your eye, a flicker, a pale cloth, slipping between the trees, caught your breath. The movement was swift and silent, vanishing as if swallowed by the mist itself. Every gaze snapped to where the firelight dared not follow, hearts tightening as if the air itself held breath. The bell tolled again, its low, resonant chime like a heartbeat, counting down the fragile moments left before night took full possession. Around the fire pit, a hush fell so deep it pressed against the eardrums. Even the usual creaking of the frozen earth seemed muted, as if the village was holding itself hostage to the waiting. You felt a coldness that had nothing to do with frost, creeping along your spine, fingers skimming beneath the coarse cloth of your cloak. The shadow out there, the watching eyes, did not blink, did not waver. It was a patient predator, poised on the brink of movement. Your breath rose in curls of mist. The fire's dying glow cast giant, twisted shapes on the rough timber cabins, shapes that flickered like ill omens. Around you, the crowd drew silently closer, huddled under the weight of something no one dared name. The old man's eyes glistened beneath heavy lids. His voice was a hoarse rasp, cracked with years of cold. And tonight, the silence breaks, and just as that final chime of the bell faded into the shivering air, the shadow beyond the firelight shifted once more, not away, but forward. A pair of eyes opened wide in the dark, watching, waiting, moving closer. The night had finally begun its advance. The night stretched its cold fingers across the village like a shroud, slowly pulling tighter. But as you stood near the dying fire, a subtle shift began. The shadow that had once pressed insistently against the tree line no longer held the same edge of menace. Instead, it softened, blending into the vast expanse where darkness met the brittle outline of leafless branches. You inhaled, the sharp air filling your lungs with a sting that reminded you how alive the world remained, even in the depths of this relentless winter. The bell's solemn toll had faded into echoes, replaced now by the tender hush of a village waking slowly from an ordeal not yet named, but already endured. The figures that had slipped from the tangled woods, pale, hungry, haunted, now sat quietly, within your shared circle of firelight. Their ragged breaths stitched a fragile thread of connection, no longer strangers, but kin, bound by the same frozen earth and the same unyielding silence that once threatened to swallow you whole. Around the fire pit, shoulders slumped from fatigue, yet lifting in the nascent glow of tentative understanding. Hands, once clenched tight around makeshift weapons, loosened, fingers uncurling, with the kind of relief that came from knowing the worst might have passed, or at least paused. The oppressive gray sky began to yield, revealing a thin veil of starlight, faint yet unwavering, an ancient promise whispered through cold nights. Near the edge of the clearing, the elder's cracked voice broke the quiet with a soft exhale. "We have faced the darkness," he said, voice rough but steady, "and it moves no more against us tonight." His gaze lingered on the circle where the faces reflected flickering flames, hope, fear, exhaustion, and a flicker of something else, peace. You looked across to the woman whose eyes had held steel beneath their shadows. She allowed herself a small, weary smile, the tension at the corners of her mouth softening just enough that you sensed renewed strength beneath her fragile exterior. She reached out, clasping the hands of those sitting near her, joining a chain of quiet solidarity. Beyond the fence, the woods seemed less a menace and more a distant breath, the edges softened by the deepening quiet. The bitter scent of smoke mingled now with the clean sharpness of frozen sap and the faint trace of dawn's first promise, a scent carried on gentle winds, as if nature itself was exhaling relief. You settled back on the worn ground, the chill still pressing, but softened by a cautious calm spreading through. Your limbs, the coarse wool of your cloak, no longer bit with the same urgency, and beneath the scratchy blanket, the weight of waiting began to lift, carried away by the ember's slow, steady glow. The village seemed to breathe in unison, exhaling tension and drawing a shaky rhythm of existence from the frozen earth. The wooden cabins, scarred by frost and time, now stood sentinel to a peace hard-earned, their cracked boards whispering tales of endurance and silent strength. In the stillness, you let your gaze wander skyward, where the first pale stars trembled softly, distant fires themselves in a velvet sea. Time slowed, the sharp edges of fear and uncertainty blurring into memory, absorbed into the quiet, the strength of this place. There, within the fragile circle of firelight, amid softened faces and the thickening hush, you felt something like home, a sanctuary carved out of cold and shadow, held together by will and whispered hopes. Your breath mingled with the warming smoke, a gentle rhythm set against the slow song of a winter morning coming to life around you. each moment stretched, delicate as frost on a window pane, fragile but real. And as the sun's first pale glow began to color the horizon, you knew the silence had changed. No longer a threat, it was a quiet companion, a tender stillness embracing the village in a final, restful pause. Outside, the snow began to fall. In soft, slow spirals, each flake a whispered promise of renewal, a delicate benediction over the hardened earth. In this moment, with the night's shadow retreating and the dawn's tender light reaching across frostbitten paths, a profound calm settled deep within your chest. The story that had unfolded here was one of shadow and silence, but it closed now with the warmth of resilience and the softest glow of hope. And so, wrapped in the embrace of cold and firelight, you drifted toward a restful quiet, the gentle crackle of embers a lullaby beneath the pale morning sky. The waiting was over. The darkness had receded. And here, in the hush of winter's fragile dawn, you could finally rest,